Haughty and majestic, for some the skyscraper has been a symbol of power and opulence. For others, however, it's a serious aggression against the environment and a monster that diverts cities away from human proportions. Ever since the beginning of the 20th century, the major cities have been competing in a stratospheric race to reach the summit. Now, however, skyscrapers are at a historic crossroads. In some cities, gigantic towers are being designed that go beyond anything seen so far. What will the skyscrapers of the future be like? I think the best way for a person to live is in a tiny house on a cliff top, in a forest, or overlooking the sea. There's nowhere more ideal than such places. But 10 million people can't live on cliff tops overlooking the sea. Faced with such a choice, when you go from 10 million to 30 or 40, there's nothing for it but to live in a different way.
The world's population will be 8 billion people. Most of those people will want to live in cities. Cities are fun, it's where it happens, it's where all the activity. So what we are talking about is the growth and the demand of cities. Cities will be larger than countries in population.
In Europe, we haven't yet reached the point where concentration becomes an economic necessity, but we will. In China and Japan, however, there are cities that have no more room left, such as Hong Kong in China. And there are cities that have grown to such an enormous size that they'll have no choice but to expand upwards. Over the next few years, Shanghai will have to grow, let's say exponentially. In a very short space of time, they'll have to create a large number of districts of 100,000 inhabitants each. In the meantime, it has grown to such huge horizontal dimensions that the energy it needs to live as a city could bring it to a standstill. Besides, the time has come when it cannot go on expanding any longer. Instead of expanding outwards, an alternative possibility is for us to draw together and conquer the vertical space. But that isn't the same thing as building a skyscraper. Conquering vertical space is something else. A vertical city is as tall as a skyscraper, but it isn't a skyscraper.
If we follow the rules that certain leading politicians and members of the royal family would follow, that we shouldn't build in London greater than 5 stories, if we took all this accommodation and reduced it to 5 stories and reconstructed it, it would build London to Dover. We would consume all our green belt, and it's not viable. And what we need to do is to understand what is ecology, what is the green belt. It is quite clear that we can't just keep spreading cities, because in the spread is not only the construction over land, lost for food and vegetation and ecology, but also the roads that need to feed those areas. The land is taken into account. So then we need to draw back to the city centre.
On continents such as Asia, housing the population is not simply a matter of speculation or aesthetics, still less an environmental issue. Hong Kong, Shanghai, New Delhi and Kuala Lumpur are overpopulated cities where the lack of land forces them to build upwards.
And so the greatest justification for skyscrapers, first one is that better land use. Because you're concentrating all the building vertically, but building vertically, then you save the land for vegetation and you don't destroy the ecosystem. Then secondly, skyscraper is much more efficient in terms of transportation because people don't have to move around so much. So because they only move around within the buildings. And the elevator is elevator and skyscraper is much more energy efficient in moving people about than in cars or by trains or by coaches.
Skyscrapers are increasingly being used for living in and not just as places for work or business. On the top floors of certain high-rise towers, there are luxury apartments that only a very few fortunate people can afford. It's not just the prices that are sky high. Living 100 or 200 meters up implies certain hazards and changes that affect the way a building's inhabitants live. Dizziness and a feeling of isolation are new factors to be taken into account when deciding whether to live beyond the 30th story of a building. Vertical growth doubtless requires a certain psychological adaptation, enabling us to live over 100 meters up.
That's the doghouse. All the dogs go here. Some of the dogs come here. And then the other one is...
I live on the 37th, 38th and 39th floor in the Barbican. I've lived here for 8 years with my 3 children and very happy here. It's very safe, it has an amazing sense of community. The worst is it can be very windy up here and the weather can be quite, it's sort of part of your home, the weather.
It's really convenient because it's right in the middle of the city where everything goes on. And it's only about 10 minutes walk to my school. But I think the worst thing is that you can't have a garden and you can't have a cat or a dog. You can only have mice or fish or hamsters which don't have very long lives.
Extreme climatic conditions and the distance from terra firma involved in living in a skyscraper appear to be the main drawbacks to life high up. But vertical living ought not to mean loss of quality of life. I think our cities lack suitable environmental conditions, or we're degrading them. And our buildings are making them even worse. So we get to the absurd situation where people put flower pots on their windowsills. We need to approach the issue in another way. We have to strike a balance with nature. But striking a balance with nature is not about creating parks. We have to put parks inside our buildings. We have to blend nature into our buildings.
This is a building that we are constructing now in Madrid, although the project goes back to 1992 and is very directly related to all the research we are doing on bionics and the lessons that nature has for architecture. For several decades now, we've been spending too much at many levels, for example, on energy. And of course, dealing with this at source, trying to use as many natural resources as possible, natural heating and air conditioning systems, seems to be the line we should be pursuing in the future. And obviously, in this building, we've tried to do this to a maximum.
The whole purpose of building buildings is to provide enclosures that protect you from the extreme climatic conditions from outside. In the 60s, around the world, we built buildings which were sealed boxes. And these sealed boxes you could build in the Sahara, or the same box you could build in the Antarctic. And there were sealed boxes that were fully air-conditioned or completely heated, and the air was sealed. Now, if you went round to majority of people around the world, they all say what they want to be is in contact with the outside. So now that we're understanding that we're designing buildings that you can be in contact.
As far as engineer Chris McCarthy is concerned, construction materials are not simply cement, steel and glass. The most important thing is to be aware of their heat-retaining capacity, their resistance to heat, their transparency, their translucence. New materials are being meticulously designed at the molecular level if necessary, to ensure that they are suited to the conditions they will have to cope with. This means working shoulder to shoulder with physics experts. Chris McCarthy and Ken Yang, together with a wide-ranging group of professionals, are involved in programs to do with the ecological equilibrium of cities. Bioclimatic architecture has emerged as an approach midway between high technology and ecological solutions, retrieving some of the ideas of the best popular architecture. Ken Yang and his partner Robert Hamza are at the head of an international architect's office in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. For more than 20 years, they've been developing an advanced technological program for designing bioclimatic buildings. The originality of what they have been doing lies in the fact that for the first time, bioclimatic architecture is being applied to skyscrapers. Their projects have already been put into practice in Europe, Asia, and the United States.
Bioclimatic design is a subset of ecological design. So my final agenda is really ecological design, which is to integrate architecture with nature or with the ecological systems of nature. But as a subset, bioclimatic design essentially means making use of the ambient energies of the locality. And it is, if you like, passive mode design. In other words, it's trying to make buildings a little bit more comfortable without the use of any electromechanical devices. And so by not using any electromechanical devices, it also acts as a low-energy building. But what is important is that it encourages natural ventilation. If it encourages natural ventilation, then you get much more fresh air and much more sunlight, and you get greater air change. So it generally is conducive to a much more healthy environment.
One of their most advanced projects consists in making use of wind and rain for the benefit of high-rise buildings, and using new materials that are specially suited to life inside a skyscraper.
This is one of the first buildings that we have built where we brought together all into one single building the experiments and ideas that we've had on bioclimatic architecture, which were in previously single buildings, to one single building. Now, many architects have developed bioclimatic design since the 60s, but very few have applied it to the design of the skyscraper. So that's what we have done, and we try to combine the principle of bioclimatic design into skyscrapers, and so that's how we developed the concept of the bioclimatic skyscraper. But now we're moving on from the bioclimatic skyscraper to the ecological skyscraper, which is more than just being low energy and passive, but also to make it green at the same time. Now that we have recycling systems, we have low embodied energy, we have low operational costs, and try and recycle and reuse as much of the materials as possible at the end of the useful life of the building.
And thanks for the aeronautics industry. They have developed the software for designing aeroplanes, so we can have the computers so we can understand how the building will operate when it's open. So we can use the wind as a friend. We can use the wind to draw the ventilation through the building when the building is overheating. We can also use shields around the building to protect it from strong prevailing winds to reduce heat loss. We can then look at single buildings, we could look at groups of buildings and look at the behaviour of the wind, so one tower protects another tower. Now we've come a long way in the designing of the towers. One thing is what we don't do is build a wall. As soon as you build a wall, the wind hits that, it falls down. We have holes through the towers so the air passes through the towers. The other thing is we don't have symmetry, so this is both smooth. So when the wind comes round, a lot of it goes round this way and other wind goes round the other side. But then we make the next level smooth, so the wind goes that way. And thus we cancel out the power of the wind in the design of the individual towers.
In most of our design, the bioclimatic architecture is also an urban design that is a vertical format. So what we do is we try to bring a little bit of what we have in the city horizontally up to the sky, which give us an opportunity to break it up, which means that we don't need to have just one floor stacked up to one another, but you have different elements of the urban elements that makes up the city in the sky.
La Torre de Madrid, que se alza en la Plaza de España de la capital, es el inmueble más alto de la península y su estructura de hormigón armado, la más alta del mundo. Todas las dependencias del edificio son exteriores.
Madrid, 21st century. 3 Spanish architects are working here on a project to construct the tallest tower in the world, the Bionic Tower that is to be built in Shanghai. There is no doubt that the bioclimatic architecture was a great step forward in the development of skyscrapers. But there's a new architecture which has gone beyond all foreseeable developments and created a veritable revolution. We're talking about bionic architecture. Bionic architecture is a different way of looking at technology and nature. And that is precisely the most important part. To make progress in science and architecture, you need to look at things differently. To be more specific, bionic architecture is like a melting pot of biology, engineering, and architecture that has a master, and that master is nature. Rosa Maria Cervera, Javier Pioz, and Eloy Zelaya regard this revolutionary architecture as a philosophy. The extraordinary variety of sources that nature offers them leads them to surround themselves with colleagues from the most diverse disciplines. Physicists and biologists are just as necessary in bionic architecture as engineers and carpenters. From their modest office in Madrid, they are preparing the most ambitious of projects, the Bionic Tower. Well, the Bionic Tower is the first model of a vertical city in existence. It looks like a skyscraper, but in fact it has nothing to do with one. The people living in the Bionic Tower might be living at the height of 1,228 meters, in an inner or empty space that is divided into 12 neighborhoods, each approximately 80 meters high, and occupying an area of about 160 by 130 meters.
The Bionic Tower is actually a vertical city. It has been designed for 100,000 inhabitants. There will be dwellings, there will be offices, there will be hotels, and there will also be a variety of small shopping and service areas that will provide the vertically developing city with what it needs.
It is run through vertically by what we call streets, vertical streets. There are 92 of these streets, which constitute the primary system of the building structure. They are hollow streets made up of gigantic columns with lifts running up and down in some of them, the air conditioning system in others, all the piping in yet others. And these columns, in summary, form a sort of underground network in inverted commas, enabling the 368 lifts that move inside them and that move vertically and horizontally to take people up from the bottom to the top in less than 2 minutes.
There are express lifts that go straight to neighbourhood 3 or 7 or 8, and these are very fast. Other lifts are local and go from one floor to another within each neighbourhood. There will also be special lifts for firefighters and other emergency services. The neighbourhoods are completely separated from each other by fully sealed areas. These areas contain water tanks, which are extremely important as they are on hand for use in the event of a fire. However, the main function of these areas is as evacuation platforms.
As a curious piece of data to supplement this, let me add that the volume of water vapour condensing on the glass every night is so great that it would be foolish to ignore it. We have therefore devised a system that operates simply by gravity to recover this huge amount of water and fill the tanks that we spoke about earlier, separating each of the different neighbourhoods. This way, it's possible to increase the reserve supply of water for use in the event of fire. Although it was originally intended for Hong Kong, the Chinese authorities have decided that the vertical city should be located in Shanghai. The tower will be built in a marshy area outside the megalopolis. This is the Laguna de Cañada de Loira, one of the places we visit from our School of Architecture and Bionics in Cuenca. The pool has a diameter of approximately 400 to 450 meters, from the top of the rock to here. We might say that this is the central part of the system supporting the tower. It's a little bit smaller, but it'll almost do to give you an idea.
Actually, this is a super building that is 1,228 meters high, but also has a 1,000 meter diameter base. The central section of this base plays an essential role in holding up the building. When we did the first calculations, we saw that it was impossible to adapt the conventional foundation systems. So we went back to thinking about nature and observed how those great tree structures support themselves. And we found the root system extremely interesting. The roots spread out, acquiring a much greater frictional capacity, and the big trees eventually end up as though they were floating in the ground, floating in a nest of roots.
If we take a piece of straw of this size, any movement like this shows it's extremely fragile. However, if we pull it like this, it's almost impossible to break it. At first sight, it seemed to be extremely fragile. But if we take the straw and cut it in half, we now have a piece that is much more rigid than it was at the beginning. The three people behind the vertical city search for inspiration in the mountains of Cuenca for their workshops on bionic architecture. The exuberance of the landscape brings the school of the gaze, as they like to call their workshops, nearer to the lessons nature has to offer us.
Bueno, esto ya ni aunque nos subamos todos encima lo aplastamos. Pero si no ha cambiado nada, sigue siendo el mismo material. ¿No? Pero la pajita, ¿qué dimensión tenía? ¿No? Finito, es decir, he aquí un infinito dentro de un finito. Somos capaces de dividir la pajita infinitas veces y cada vez que la dividimos multiplicamos por 2 o por 4 su resistencia. No hay límite en la división. Para la naturaleza,
it's much easier for nature to make a lot of much smaller parts than a big one. It's much easier for conventional architects to make thick columns than a lot of much thinner ones. When you take a good look at a tree and you give it a good, hard push, you realize that when it's very windy, the top of the tree moves, but the central section does not move as much. A building is not a tree, and we have to work on that basis, but it can function on the same principle. A tree is not a column of concrete. A building sometimes looks like a column of concrete. A tree is a system of extremely fine tubes arranged side by side, like a handful of straws, of drinking straws. A lot of straws all together, really close to each other. But not 50 or 100 or 1,000, but millions of tiny straws tightly packed together. If you look inside a vein of a tree, you see something similar to this. It's like a little cake made of puff pastry, and inside there are some tiny veins conducting fluids. All the membranes inside each of the tiny veins contribute millions and millions of elements that ensure that this tree occupies a very small surface area and yet is extremely strong and elastic. And this is what we might call a fractal structure, and that's the contribution our Bionic Tower will make, a new concept of structure, where the main thing is not the part itself, the beam or the column, but the whole arrangement of thousands of elements.
La estructura flexoplástica aguanta, se deforma y recupera, pero la piedra no es una estructura flexoplástica. La piedra se ha roto y esas pajitas que utilizamos para beber Coca-Cola y nuestros refrescos, ¿no? Pues fijaros, aguanta, resiste.
One of the big problems posed by the construction of a gigantic vertical structure is its impact resistance to seismic movements. To solve this problem, Bionic Architecture has taken another look at nature. Most people think this is a lemon. Of course, so do I. Obviously, this is a lemon. When we started thinking about an earthquake-resistant system, we knew that the best chance a skyscraper has of withstanding an earthquake is for the shock waves to have lost a lot of their strength by the time they reach the building. Let's say it's like putting a pencil in a pot of yogurt. I put it in the yogurt is deformed, but the pencil is not affected. Nature has something similar to this, a lemon. I can squeeze it in my hands with all my might, but I cannot break it. If we now take a look inside the lemon, the first thing that attracts our attention is the fact that it is shaped like a bicycle wheel. Trees are also organized in this way. All the veins are arranged in a kind of tiny cycles, but if we were to look even closer, we would see that it is not a gelatinous mass, but is actually made up of fine, tiny membranes and liquid. The unified force of all these tiny membranes, just like that other tiny element, the cut straw, plus all the droplets of water inside, form a plastic insulating material of enormous strength. So if I were to put the Bionic Tower inside a giant lemon and squeeze the walls, the impact strength of the earthquake would be weakened by tiny deformations of each of the membranes and the droplets of water. Very little of the force would reach the Bionic Tower. That is what we call a plastic insulation seismic system. Well, we haven't invented anything with this seismic system. All we've done is reinterpret a lemon. The construction of the Bionic Tower is due to be completed by the year 2015. If the current demographic growth rate is maintained, by then the world's population will be well over the 8,000 million mark. Perhaps skyscrapers will cease to be an urban monster and become a predecessor of the cities of the future, vertical cities.